The flight deck of the USS Valiant shuddered violently as 40-foot waves crashed against its steel hull. Hurricane Elena, a Category 4 monster with winds exceeding 150 miles per hour, had turned the Atlantic Ocean into a churning nightmare of white foam and towering water walls. The massive aircraft carrier, all 100,000 tons of it, pitched and rolled like a child's toy in a bathtub. In the ship's air traffic control tower, Commander Marcus Webb gripped the radio with white knuckles as he watched the storm radar display. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. A single green blip moved steadily through the hurricanes. Outer bands fighting against winds that could tear apart buildings on shore. The pilot's voice crackled through the static, calm and steady despite flying through hell itself. Tower, this is Lieutenant Sarah Chen requesting immediate landing clearance. I have wounded aboard requiring urgent medical attention. Webb's stomach dropped. Landing a fighter jet on an aircraft carrier in perfect weather was already one of the most dangerous maneuvers in aviation. Attempting it during a hurricane was considered impossible by every pilot training manual ever written. The landing strip was pitching up and down 20 feet with each wave. The crosswinds were gusting at deadly speeds, and visibility was near zero. Negative, Lieutenant. Weather conditions are beyond operational limits. Divert to nearest land. Base. Tower, nearest alternative is 400 miles to the storm's eye. I have a Marine with internal bleeding who won't survive the flight. Request emergency clearance. Webb looked at the meteorological officer, who shook his head grimly. The deck was moving too violently. The approach angle was constantly changing. One miscalculation would send the aircraft sliding off the deck into the ocean, or worse, crashing into the superstructure where 3,000 sailors lived and worked. Stand by, Lieutenant. But before Webb could respond, the radio crackled again. This time, the voice was different, older, authoritative, speaking with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from facing death so many times it becomes routine. Tower, this is Captain Elena Rodriguez. I'm taking over this approach. Webb's blood turned to ice. Rodriguez. He knew that name. Every Navy pilot knew that name. But it couldn't be her. Elena Rodriguez had disappeared from active duty 15 years ago under circumstances that were still classified. The woman who had once been called the most skilled carrier pilot in naval history had vanished into the bureaucratic shadows, her name mentioned only in whispers among the old-timers. Captain Rodriguez, identify yourself and your authority to assume command of this aircraft. I'm the pilot, Commander. I've been the pilot all along. The story of Elena Rodriguez began 25 years earlier at the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland, where she had arrived as an 18-year-old midshipman carrying nothing but a worn duffel bag and a determination forged in the steel mills of Pittsburgh. Her father, Miguel Rodriguez, had worked the furnaces for 30 years, his hands permanently stained with soot and his lungs forever marked by the smoke. Her mother, Maria, had cleaned office buildings at night to pay for Elena's flight lessons. At the local airport, Elena wasn't the tallest candidate, wasn't the strongest, and certainly wasn't the most privileged. While her classmates arrived in their parents' luxury cars, with multiple suitcases and private tutoring backgrounds, Elena stepped off a Greyhound bus with calloused hands from working construction jobs since she was 14. What she lacked in pedigree, she made up for in something rarer and more valuable, an absolute refusal to accept limitations. Her first flight instructor at the academy, Commander James Mitchell, later recalled that Elena possessed something he had never seen. In 40 years of training naval aviators, she didn't just learn to fly aircraft. She seemed to communicate with them. Where other students fought against the controls, Elena worked with them. Where others saw complex mechanical systems, Elena saw extensions of her own body. The T-6 Texan trainer aircraft, a stubborn and unforgiving machine that had humbled countless student pilots, responded to Elena's touch like a symphony responding to a master conductor. Her first solo flight, typically a nerve-wracking experience that left most students white-knuckled and exhausted, ended with Elena performing a series of aerobatic maneuvers that weren't scheduled to be taught until advanced training. When she landed, her instructor asked how she had known to execute those moves. "The plane told me what it wanted to do," Elena had replied simply. "I just listened." But natural ability, no matter how extraordinary, meant nothing without the intellectual foundation to support it. Elena attacked her academic studies with the same intensity she brought to flying. Navigation, meteorology, aircraft systems, flight, dynamics, tactical theory, she absorbed it all with a hunger that impressed even her most demanding professors. While other midshipmen studied to pass tests, Elena studied to understand the fundamental principles that would keep her alive when she was alone in a cockpit with nothing but her knowledge and instincts. Her grades were exceptional, but it was her performance in the simulator that truly set her apart. The flight simulation laboratory at the Academy was equipped with the most advanced training systems available, capable of replicating every possible emergency scenario a naval aviator might face. Engine failures, hydraulic system malfunctions, electrical fires, instrument failures and bad weather, the simulators could create any combination of disasters that the instructors could imagine. Elena didn't just survive these simulated emergencies. She seemed to thrive on them. The more complex the problem, the more systems that failed simultaneously, the calmer she became. Her classmates watched in awe as she would work through cascading failures that would have overwhelmed experienced pilots, her hands moving across the controls with surgical precision while her voice remained steady and methodical. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Walsh, the Academy's senior flight instructor, had been initially skeptical of Elena's reputation. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She had seen too many promising students crack under the pressure of carrier operations, where the margin for error was measured in inches and split seconds. But after observing Elena's performance during advanced training exercises, Walsh began to understand that she was witnessing something unprecedented. Most pilots fight their way through emergency procedures, Walsh would later write in her evaluation report. Midshipman Rodriguez doesn't fight emergencies, she dances with them. She sees patterns and solutions that others miss, and she executes them with a precision that suggests years of experience rather than months of training. The transition from land-based training to carrier operations was where most naval aviators discovered their true limits. Landing on a moving aircraft carrier deck is universally acknowledged as the most challenging aspect of military aviation. The landing area is only 500 feet long and 150 feet wide, a postage stamp of steel moving through the ocean at 30 knots. The pilot must catch one of 4 arresting wires with a tailhook while maintaining exactly the right speed and angle of approach. Too fast, and the aircraft will skip over the wires and crash into the barriers. Too slow, and it will drop into the ocean short of the deck. Elena's first carrier landing came during her junior year aboard the USS Constellation during routine training operations off the coast of California. The weather was perfect, the seas were calm, and the deck was as steady as a carrier deck ever gets. Her instructor, Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez, no relation, despite the shared surname, sat in the backseat of the T-45 Goshawk trainer, ready to take control if the approach went wrong. As they flew the landing pattern, Elena's voice came through the intercom system with characteristic calm. "Paddles, this is Rodriguez, requesting landing approach." "Roger, Rodriguez, you're cleared for approach." "Call the ball." The ball was the optical landing system, a series of lights that helped pilots maintain the correct glide path during their approach. Elena's job was to keep the amber light centered between the green datum lights, indicating she was on the proper angle to catch the arresting wire. Rodriguez Goshawk Ball, 3, 2, Elena called, indicating her aircraft type and fuel state. What happened next became legendary among the carrier's crew. Elena's approach was so smooth, so perfectly controlled, that the landing signal officers initially thought they were watching a computer simulation. The aircraft descended toward the deck in a perfect straight line, the approach angle never varying by more than a fraction of a degree. Her airspeed was locked at exactly 145 knots, the optimal speed for a safe landing. The Goshawk's tailhook caught the number 3 wire with a precision that seemed almost supernatural. The aircraft decelerated smoothly to a stop, and Elena taxied, clear of the landing area with the same methodical precision she had shown during the approach. The entire evolution, from entering the landing pattern to clearing the deck, had taken less than 4 minutes. The landing signal officer, Chief Petty Officer Williams, who had guided thousands of carrier landings during his 20-year career, keyed his radio with something approaching reverence in his voice. "Rodriguez, that was a perfect pass. Textbook. Doesn't begin to describe it." But Elena wasn't finished. Over the next 2 hours, she performed 17 more carrier landings, each one as flawless as the first. She landed in different wind conditions with different fuel loads and during different times of day. Each landing was executed with the same mechanical precision, as if she were following a blueprint visible only to her. Word of Elena's performance spread quickly through the carrier's crew. Pilots who had been flying carrier operations for years came to watch her land, trying to understand how someone so new to carrier aviation could perform with such consistency. Her technique was studied, analyzed, and copied, but nobody could replicate the intuitive understanding she seemed to possess. Captain Robert Harrison, the Constellation's commanding officer, personally reviewed the video recordings of Elena's landings, a former Top Gun instructor with over 4,000 hours of carrier flying time. Harrison had seen every possible variation of carrier landing technique. But Elena's approach was something entirely new. "She's not flying the approach," Harrison told his air wing commander. "She's predicting it. She's reading the deck motion, the wind patterns, the aircraft's response to atmospheric conditions, and she's making corrections before the problems even develop. It's like she can see 3 seconds into the future." Elena's reputation preceded her when she arrived at advanced strike training at Naval Air Station Lemoore in California. The instructors there were prepared for a gifted student, but they weren't prepared for what Elena actually was. A pilot who seemed to rewrite the rules of what was possible in military aviation. The F/A-18 Hornet, the Navy's primary strike fighter, was a complex and demanding aircraft that required months of training to master. Elena soloed in the Hornet after just 6 flights, setting a new record for the training program. Her first air-to-air combat exercise ended with her shooting down 2 instructors who had been flying the Hornet for over a decade. Her first bombing run achieved an accuracy score that exceeded the minimum requirements for graduation from the entire program. But it was during night carrier operations that Elena truly distinguished herself. Night carrier landings were considered the most dangerous routine operation in military aviation. Pilots had to approach the deck in complete darkness, relying entirely on instruments and the optical landing system. The psychological pressure was immense. One mistake would likely be fatal, and there was no margin for error. Elena's first night carrier landing came during a stormy evening in the Pacific, with cloud cover that blocked any ambient light from the stars or moon. The deck was pitching in heavy seas, and several experienced pilots had been forced to make multiple attempts before successfully landing. Elena's approach was steady and controlled, her radio transmissions calm and professional. Paddles Rodriguez Hornet Ball 4-1 Auto. The optical landing system was barely visible through the rain and spray. But Elena's aircraft tracked down the glide path with machine-like precision. She touched down exactly on centerline, caught the 3-wire, and taxied clear without the slightest hesitation. The landing signal officer's evaluation was simple: perfect pass in impossible conditions. Over the next 3 years, Elena compiled a record of achievement that had never been seen before in naval aviation. She graduated first in her class from every school she attended. She set new records for accuracy in air-to-ground operations. She was selected for the most challenging assignments and excelled in each one. Her peers viewed her with a mixture of admiration and bewilderment. She made the impossible look routine. But Elena's true test came during her first combat deployment aboard the USS Enterprise during Operation Desert Storm. The Enterprise was stationed in the Persian Gulf, launching round-the-clock strikes against Iraqi targets. The pace of operations was relentless, with aircraft launching and recovering every few minutes during peak periods. Elena's first combat mission was a strike against an Iraqi radar installation deep in enemy territory. The target was defended by surface-to-air missiles and anti-aircraft guns, and intelligence reports suggested that Iraqi fighter aircraft might attempt to intercept the strike package. Elena was assigned as wingman to Commander Patricia Thompson, a veteran pilot with over 200 combat missions. The mission briefing was thorough and sobering. The target was located in a heavily defended area. The weather was marginal, and the threat level was assessed as high. Elena listened to the briefing with the same calm attention she brought to every aspect of flying, asking technical questions about the target's defenses and the planned ingress route. "Any concerns about your first combat mission, Lieutenant?" Commander Thompson asked as they walked to their aircraft. "No, ma'am," Elena replied. "It's just another flight." But it wasn't just another flight. As the 2-aircraft formation approached the target area, Iraqi surface-to-air missiles began launching from multiple locations. The sky filled with smoke trails and explosions as the missiles searched for their targets. Elena's Hornets shuddered from the concussion of nearby explosions, but her flying remained steady and precise. "SAM launch, 10 o'clock. Commander Thompson called over the radio. Elena had already seen the missile and was maneuvering to defeat it. Her aircraft pulled into a high G-turn that would have disoriented most pilots, but Elena maintained perfect situational awareness throughout the maneuver. She deployed chaff and flares to confuse the missile's guidance system, while simultaneously positioning herself for the attack run on the target. The radar installation was protected by a network of anti-aircraft guns that filled the air with tracers and explosive shells. Elena flew through the defensive fire with the same methodical precision she had shown during training, never deviating from the optimal attack profile. Her bombs hit the target with surgical accuracy, destroying the radar antenna and its associated equipment. But the mission wasn't over. As the 2 Hornets turned away from the target, Elena's radar warning receiver detected the approach of 2 Iraqi MiG-29 fighter aircraft. The MiGs were faster and more maneuverable than the heavily loaded Hornets, and they were positioned to intercept the American aircraft before they could reach friendly airspace. "Bandits, 12 o'clock high, 20 miles in closing," Elena called calmly. Commander Thompson was already maneuvering to engage the Iraqi fighters, but Elena had seen something that her flight leader had missed. The MiGs were flying in a tactical formation that suggested they were planning to split up and attack from different directions. Elena's response was immediate and decisive. "Lead, recommend we separate and engage them individually. They're setting up a pincer movement." Thompson agreed, and the 2 Hornets split apart to engage the Iraqi fighters. Elena's opponent was an experienced pilot who had been flying the MiG-29 for years, but he had never faced anyone with Elena's unique combination of technical skill and tactical intuition. The aerial battle lasted less than 2 minutes. Elena maneuvered her Hornet through a series of complex maneuvers that kept her opponent from achieving a favorable firing position, while simultaneously setting up her own attack. When the opportunity presented itself, she fired a single AIM-9 Sidewinder missile that guided perfectly to its target. The MiG-29 exploded in a brilliant fireball, and Elena turned to assist her flight leader. Commander Thompson had successfully engaged her opponent as well, and the two Hornets rejoined formation for the flight back to the carrier. As they approached the Enterprise, Elena's fuel gauge showed critically low levels. The extended combat maneuvering had consumed more fuel than planned. "Elena, you're going to be tight on fuel," Thompson observed. "Yes, ma'am. I have enough for one approach." Landing on a carrier deck with minimal fuel was another test of a pilot's skill and nerves. There was no second chance, no opportunity to go around and try again. Elena would have to execute a perfect landing on her first attempt, or risk running out of fuel and crashing into the ocean. The carrier landing that followed was witnessed by hundreds of crew members, who had gathered on the deck to watch the returning strike aircraft. Elena's approach was flawless despite the fuel emergency, her Hornet settling onto the deck with the same precision she had shown during training. She caught the 3-wire and taxied clear of the landing area with less than 200 pounds of fuel remaining. The after-action report from Elena's first combat mission became required reading at the Navy's fighter weapons school. Her performance had been exceptional in every measurable category: target destruction, threat defeat, air-to-air combat, and emergency procedures. But what impressed the mission analysts most was her ability to maintain perfect situational awareness throughout the entire mission while executing each phase with textbook precision. Elena's reputation within the Navy's fighter community grew rapidly. She was selected for the most challenging assignments, often flying missions that other pilots considered too dangerous or complex. Her success rate was unprecedented. She had never failed to complete a mission, never made a landing approach that wasn't successful, and never made a tactical error that compromised mission objectives. During her second deployment, Elena was assigned to a special operations unit that flew missions requiring the highest levels of skill and precision. These missions were classified at the highest levels, but Elena's performance continued to exceed all expectations. She flew night missions in terrible weather, precision strikes against heavily defended targets, and reconnaissance flights deep into enemy territory. Her fellow pilots viewed her with a mixture of professional respect and personal bewilderment. Elena seemed to operate on a different level than everyone else, seeing patterns and solutions that others missed. She could predict weather changes before they showed up on meteorological reports. She could identify mechanical problems before they became apparent to maintenance crews. She could read enemy tactics and respond with countermeasures that seemed to anticipate their moves. But Elena's extraordinary abilities came with a price. The constant pressure of performing at superhuman levels, combined with the inherent dangers of carrier aviation, began to take its toll. She slept less, ate little, and focused entirely on flying. Her social interactions became minimal, and she developed a reputation for being aloof and unapproachable. Commander Lisa Martinez, the Enterprise's flight surgeon, began to notice changes in Elena's behavior during routine medical examinations. Elena's responses to questions were shorter and more direct. Her physical condition remained excellent, but there were signs of chronic stress and fatigue that concerned the medical staff. "Elena, you're pushing yourself too hard," Martinez observed. During one examination, "You need to take some time to decompress." "I'm fine, Doc, just focused on the mission." But Elena wasn't fine. The combination of exceptional ability and relentless operational tempo was creating a situation that would eventually reach a breaking point. She was performing at levels that no human pilot should be able to sustain, and the physical and psychological demands were accumulating like interest on an unpaid debt. The breaking point came during Elena's third deployment, this time aboard the USS Roosevelt during operations in the Mediterranean. The pace of operations was intense, with multiple strikes being launched daily against various targets. Elena was flying almost every day, often multiple missions, and her performance remained flawless despite the exhausting schedule. The mission that would change everything began as a routine strike against a terrorist training facility in a remote mountain region. Elena was assigned as the mission commander, responsible for leading a 4-aircraft formation against a heavily defended target. The weather was marginal, with low clouds and poor visibility that made navigation challenging. As the strike formation approached the target area, Elena's radar warning receiver detected the launch of multiple surface-to-air missiles. The defensive fire was heavier than expected, and the formation found itself under attack from multiple directions. Elena's response was immediate and decisive. She maneuvered her formation to avoid the missiles while maintaining course toward the target. But this time, something was different. Elena's usually perfect situational awareness seemed fragmented, as if she were seeing only parts of the tactical picture. The chronic fatigue and stress were finally affecting her performance, creating small delays in her decision-making process that had never been present before. "Lead SAM launch 2 o'clock, called her wingman. Elena had already seen the missile, but her response was a fraction of a second slower than usual. Her aircraft pulled into an evasive maneuver that was technically correct, but lacked the precise timing that had characterized her previous performances. The missile passed close, enough to her aircraft that the proximity fuse detonated, sending shrapnel through her port engine. The FA-18 Hornet could fly on a single engine, but Elena's aircraft was now significantly less maneuverable and had reduced power available. She continued the mission, successfully destroying the target with a precision bomb attack, but the flight back to the carrier would be challenging with a damaged aircraft. As the formation approached the Roosevelt, Elena's damaged engine began to lose power completely. The aircraft was becoming increasingly difficult to control, and her fuel consumption had increased significantly due to the engine damage. Elena would have to execute a single-engine carrier, landing with minimal fuel, one of the most challenging situations a naval aviator could face. "Elena, you're cleared for emergency approach," the air traffic controller radioed. "Deck is ready for your arrival." Elena's response was characteristic of her professional demeanor. "Roger, beginning approach." The carrier landing that followed was watched by every off-duty pilot and crew member who could find a vantage point. Elena's approach was perfect despite the damaged aircraft, her Hornet settling onto the deck with the same precision she had shown throughout her career. She caught the 2-wire and taxied clear of the landing area, shutting down the damaged engine as maintenance crews surrounded her aircraft. The post-flight inspection revealed that Elena's aircraft had suffered more damage than initially apparent. The engine failure had been caused by multiple shrapnel hits that had severed fuel lines and damaged critical components. Most pilots would have declared an emergency and requested immediate landing clearance, but Elena had continued the mission and successfully destroyed the target before returning to the carrier. The incident report praised Elena's performance and recommended her for a commendation, but it also noted that her decision to continue the mission with a damaged aircraft represented an unnecessary risk. The report suggested that Elena's judgment might have been affected by fatigue and recommended that she be given a period of rest before returning to flight operations. Elena's response to the recommendation was predictable. She requested to return to flying status immediately. She argued that the mission had been successful, that no other aircraft or personnel had been endangered by her decisions, and that she was fully capable of continuing operations. Her commanding officer, Captain Michael Stevens, was faced with a difficult decision. Elena Rodriguez was the most skilled pilot in his air wing, possibly the most skilled pilot he had ever commanded. Her performance record was flawless, her technical knowledge was exceptional, and her tactical abilities were unmatched. But the incident report suggested that even Elena had limits, and that those limits were being approached more rapidly than anyone had anticipated. "Elena, you've been flying almost continuously for 3 years," Captain Stevens said during their meeting. "You need to take some time to rest and recharge." "Sir, I'm fully capable of continuing flight operations." The mission was successful, and the aircraft damage was minimal. "The issue isn't your capability, Elena. The issue is sustainability. You're pushing yourself beyond what's reasonable for any pilot, regardless of skill level." But Elena couldn't accept the concept of limitations. She had spent her entire career proving that what others considered impossible was merely challenging, that what others feared was simply another problem to be solved. The idea that she might need to reduce her operational tempo was incompatible with her understanding of herself and her role as a naval aviator. The compromise that was reached reflected the complexity of the situation. Elena would continue flying, but her mission load would be reduced to allow for adequate rest between flights. She would also be required to meet regularly with the flight surgeon to monitor her physical and psychological condition. The arrangement was designed to protect Elena while still utilizing her exceptional abilities. For several months, the arrangement worked as intended. Elena's performance remained excellent, and the reduced mission load seemed to provide the rest she needed. She continued to fly the most challenging missions, but with adequate time for recovery between operations. The flight surgeon's reports indicated that Elena's stress levels were returning to normal ranges. But the arrangement couldn't last indefinitely. As operations intensified and the demand for skilled pilots increased, the temptation to utilize Elena's abilities more heavily became overwhelming. Mission planners began requesting her for increasingly complex operations, and Elena never refused an assignment regardless of its difficulty or danger. The final mission of Elena's active career came during her 4th deployment, this time aboard the USS Lincoln during operations in the Indian Ocean. The mission was classified at the highest levels, but it involved a precision strike against a high-value target located in an extremely hostile environment. Elena was selected as the mission commander based on her proven ability to succeed in impossible situations. The mission briefing was unlike any Elena had received before. The target was located in a mountainous region with extreme weather conditions, defended by the most advanced surface-to-air missile systems available, and intelligence reports suggested that enemy fighter aircraft would actively pursue the strike formation. The mission would require flying at the absolute limits of aircraft performance in conditions that would challenge even the most experienced pilots. Elena's response to the briefing was characteristic. "When do we launch?" The mission itself was successful from a tactical perspective. Elena's formation penetrated the enemy's defenses, destroyed the target with surgical precision, and returned to the carrier despite facing the heaviest defensive fire any of them had ever encountered. But the cost of the mission was higher than anyone had anticipated. Elena's aircraft had been damaged by defensive fire, and she had pushed herself and her aircraft beyond their design limits to complete the mission. When she landed on the Lincoln's deck, both she and her aircraft were at the end of their operational capability. The post-flight medical examination revealed that Elena was suffering from severe exhaustion and stress-related symptoms that could no longer be ignored. The flight surgeon's report was unambiguous. Elena Rodriguez needed to be removed from flight status immediately. Her physical and psychological condition had deteriorated to the point where continued operations would be dangerous both for her and for the pilots who flew with her. The report recommended a minimum of 6 months of rest and rehabilitation before Elena could be considered for return to flight operations. Elena's response was predictable and devastating. She requested immediate transfer to a non-flying assignment, rather than accept the temporary grounding. She argued that if she couldn't fly at the highest operational level, she didn't want to fly at all. Her commanding officer tried to convince her to accept the temporary grounding, but Elena's mind was made up. "Sir, I've always believed that Excellence is not negotiable, Elena said during their final meeting. If I can't perform at the level that's expected of me, then I shouldn't be in the cockpit at all. The transfer request was approved, and Elena Rodriguez disappeared from active flight operations as suddenly as she had appeared. She was assigned to a staff position at the Pentagon, where her technical knowledge and operational experience could be utilized in planning and analysis roles. But for Elena, the transition from flying to staff work was devastating. The woman who had once been the most skilled carrier pilot in naval history found herself sitting in meetings and writing reports instead of flying missions. Her days were filled with bureaucratic procedures and administrative tasks that utilized only a fraction of her capabilities. The aircraft that had once been extensions of her body were now distant memories, and the sense of purpose that had driven her throughout her career had been replaced by a profound sense of loss. Elena Rodriguez stared at the gray walls of her Pentagon office, watching the morning sunlight filter through Venetian blinds that hadn't been cleaned in months. The desk in front of her was covered with requisition forms, budget analyses, and operational reports that required her signature paperwork that any competent administrator could handle. Outside her window, she could see the Potomac River flowing steadily toward the Chesapeake Bay, where aircraft carriers moved in and out of Norfolk Naval Base like mechanical giants returning from distant wars. The irony wasn't lost on her. She could see the carriers, but she couldn't fly to them. She could read mission reports from operations she had once led, but she couldn't participate in them. The woman who had once been trusted with the Navy's most critical strike missions was now responsible for analyzing fuel consumption reports and maintenance schedules. Her new assignment came with an impressive title: Senior Aviation Operations Analyst, Joint Chiefs of Staff. Her security clearance remained at the highest levels, and her salary had actually increased from her flight pay. On paper, the position represented a promotion, a natural career progression for an experienced naval aviator transitioning to staff work. But Elena understood what it really was: a carefully constructed exile that removed her from flying while preserving the illusion that her talents were still being utilized. The work itself was intellectually demanding in its own way. Elena was responsible for analyzing operational data from carrier strike groups worldwide, identifying patterns and trends that could improve mission effectiveness and aircraft utilization. Her reports were read by admirals and generals. Her recommendations were implemented across the fleet, and her technical expertise was respected by colleagues throughout the Pentagon. But none of it mattered to Elena, because none of it involved flying. Commander Janet Walsh, Elena's immediate supervisor, had tried to make the transition as smooth as possible. Walsh was a former naval aviator herself, though her flying career had been cut short by a training accident that left her with permanent injuries. She understood the psychological challenges that pilots faced when transitioning to staff work, and she had structured Elena's assignment to maximize the use of her operational experience. Elena, your analysis of the Pacific Fleet's maintenance procedures has identified efficiency improvements that could save the Navy millions of dollars annually, Walsh said during one of their weekly meetings. Admiral Thompson specifically mentioned your work during the budget review. Elena nodded politely, but her expression remained unchanged. Thank you, ma'am. I'm glad the analysis was useful. Walsh could see that Elena was struggling with the transition, but she wasn't sure how to help. Elena's work was exemplary, her reports were thorough, her analysis was insightful, and her recommendations were practical and well-reasoned. But there was no enthusiasm in her performance, no sense of purpose or engagement. She was going through the motions of being a staff officer without embracing the role. The problem was that Elena had defined herself entirely through flying. Her identity, her sense of purpose, her understanding of her place in the world, all of it was connected to being in the cockpit of a fighter aircraft. Without that connection, she felt adrift in a way that she had never experienced before. The skills that had made her legendary as a pilot, her ability to see patterns, to anticipate problems, to make split-second decisions under pressure, were still present, but they had no meaningful outlet in her current assignment. Elena's colleagues in the Pentagon tried to include her in their social activities, but she remained aloof and distant. After-work gatherings at local bars, weekend recreational activities, office parties, Elena attended when required by protocol, but she never engaged genuinely with her peers. She answered questions when asked, contributed to conversations when necessary, but she never initiated social contact or showed interest in developing friendships. The truth was that Elena felt like she was living someone else's life. The person who sat in Pentagon meetings and wrote operational analyses wasn't the same person who had landed fighter jets on carrier decks during hurricanes. That person had been confident, decisive, and completely in control of her environment. This person felt uncertain, disconnected, and powerless to influence the outcomes that mattered most to her. The psychological impact of the transition was compounded by Elena's personality and background. She had never learned to find satisfaction in anything other than excellence, and excellence in staff work felt meaningless compared to excellence in flying. Writing a brilliant analysis of carrier operations was a poor substitute for actually conducting carrier operations. Understanding tactical problems intellectually was no replacement for solving them in real time with lives hanging in the balance. Elena's apartment in Arlington reflected her emotional state. The walls were bare except for a single photograph of her standing next to an F/A-18 Hornet on the deck of the USS Roosevelt. The furniture was minimal and utilitarian: a couch, a television, a small dining table, and a bed. There were no decorations, no personal touches, no indication that the apartment was anything more than a place to sleep between workdays. Her daily routine was rigid and mechanical. She woke at 05:00, completed a physical training regimen that maintained her flight-ready condition, despite having no aircraft to fly, ate a simple breakfast, and arrived at the Pentagon by 07:00. Her workday was productive but joyless, filled with tasks that utilized her analytical abilities without engaging her passion. She left the office at 1700, returned to her apartment, ate dinner alone, and went to bed early. Weekends were the worst. Without the structure of work to occupy her time, Elena found herself confronting the emptiness of her new existence. She would sometimes drive to Andrews Air Force Base or Reagan National Airport, standing at the fence line watching aircraft take off and land. The sound of jet engines still stirred something deep inside her, but it was a painful reminder of what she had lost rather than a source of inspiration. Elena's family tried to maintain contact, but their conversations became increasingly strained. Her parents could hear the change in her voice, the absence of the enthusiasm that had always characterized her discussions of flying. Her father, Miguel, had worked his entire life in jobs that provided financial security without personal fulfillment, and he couldn't understand why Elena seemed so unhappy with a prestigious position that paid well and offered opportunities for advancement. "Mia, you're working at the Pentagon," he said during one of their phone conversations. "You're advising generals and admirals. This is success. This is what we worked for all those years." Elena struggled to explain her feelings without seeming ungrateful for the opportunities she had been given. "Papa, it's a good job. I'm just adjusting to the change." But adjustment wasn't happening. If anything, Elena was becoming more isolated and disconnected as time passed. The initial hope that she might find satisfaction in staff work was fading, replaced by a growing sense that she had made a fundamental error in accepting the assignment. The military bureaucracy that had once seemed like a necessary evil now felt like a prison, and Elena couldn't see a path back to the cockpit that didn't require her to admit that she had been wrong about her own limitations. The breaking point came during Elena's second year at the Pentagon, when she was assigned to lead a comprehensive review of carrier aviation training procedures. The project was significant. Her recommendations would influence how the Navy trained fighter pilots for the next decade. It was exactly the kind of assignment that should have energized Elena, combining her operational experience with her analytical skills to solve important problems. Elena threw herself into the project with characteristic thoroughness. She interviewed hundreds of pilots, reviewed thousands of hours of training data, and analyzed accident reports going back 15 years. Her findings were comprehensive and damning. The Navy's training programs were producing pilots who were technically proficient, but lacked the intuitive understanding necessary for truly exceptional performance. The report Elena submitted was a masterpiece of operational analysis. She identified specific deficiencies in the training curriculum, recommended changes to simulator protocols, and proposed new evaluation standards that would better prepare pilots for the realities of carrier operations. Her work was praised by senior leadership and immediately implemented across the training command. But the process of writing the report had been torture for Elena. Every interview with a young pilot reminded her of her own early career, when flying had been a source of joy rather than a distant memory. Every piece of training footage she reviewed showed her the kind of precision and skill that she had once possessed but could no longer exercise. Every recommendation she made was based on experience that she was no longer allowed to use. The final straw came when Elena was invited to brief her findings to the Chief of Naval Operations, the highest-ranking officer in the Navy. The briefing was scheduled to take place in the Pentagon's most secure conference room, with an audience that included admirals, generals, and senior civilian officials. It was the kind of high-level presentation that could make a staff officer's career. Elena prepared for the briefing with meticulous attention to detail. Her slides were perfectly formatted, her data was thoroughly verified, and her recommendations were clearly articulated. She had rehearsed the presentation multiple times, anticipating questions and preparing comprehensive answers. From a professional standpoint, she was completely ready. But when Elena stood at the front of the conference room, looking at an audience of senior leaders who were responsible for making life-and-death decisions about naval aviation, she felt a profound sense of disconnection. These people were discussing the training of pilots who would fly the missions that Elena had once flown herself. They were making decisions about aircraft operations based on analyses that Elena had prepared from her desk rather than her cockpit. The briefing itself went perfectly. Elena presented her findings clearly and confidently, answered questions with authority and precision, and received praise from the Chief of Naval Operations himself. Her recommendations were approved for immediate implementation, and she was commended for the quality of her work. By any objective measure, the briefing was a complete success. But as Elena walked back to her office after the briefing, she realized that success in staff work felt like failure compared to success in flying. The praise she had received for her analytical work was hollow compared to the satisfaction she had once felt after completing a challenging mission. The sense of accomplishment that should have come from influencing Navy policy was absent, replaced by a growing awareness that she was living a diminished version of her former life. That evening, Elena sat in her apartment staring at the photograph of herself standing next to the FA-18 Hornet. The woman in the picture looked confident and purposeful, completely at home in her environment. Elena barely recognized herself in that image anymore. The person she had become successful by conventional measures, but spiritually empty, felt like a stranger wearing her face. The decision Elena made that night would have seemed impossible to anyone who knew her reputation for unwavering commitment and professional excellence. She submitted a formal request for transfer to a non-operational assignment outside the Washington area, specifically requesting duty that would not involve aviation in any capacity. When Commander Walsh asked for an explanation, Elena provided only the minimum required justification. She was seeking a change in career direction that would allow her to develop new professional skills. The request was approved with surprising speed. Elena's performance at the Pentagon had been exemplary, but her supervisors had noticed her lack of engagement and emotional distance. They interpreted her transfer request as a positive step toward finding a role that better suited her post-flying career aspirations. Within 60 days, Elena received orders to Naval Station Norfolk, where she would serve as a logistics coordinator responsible for managing the supply chain for various support services. The assignment was about as far from flying as it was possible to get while remaining in the Navy. Elena would be responsible for coordinating the delivery of everything from office supplies to food services for the base's support facilities. It was important work that required organizational skills and attention to detail, but it bore no resemblance to the high-stakes operational environment where Elena had once thrived. Elena's colleagues at the Pentagon organized a farewell reception to mark her departure. The event was well attended and professionally cordial, with speeches praising her contributions to naval aviation analysis and wishes for success in her new assignment. Elena accepted the praise graciously and thanked everyone for their support, but her heart wasn't in the celebration. She was moving from one form of exile to another, trading analytical work about flying for administrative work that had nothing to do with aviation at all. The drive from Washington to Norfolk took Elena past Patuxent River Naval Air Station, where she had completed her test pilot training years earlier. She pulled into a parking area overlooking the airfield and watched F/A-18 Hornets practice carrier landing approaches on the runway. The sight was both beautiful and painful, a reminder of skills and experiences that had once defined her, but were now relegated to memory. Elena's new assignment at Norfolk was exactly what she had requested, completely disconnected from aviation operations. Her office was located in an administrative building far from the flight line, and her daily responsibilities involved spreadsheets, procurement contracts, and delivery schedules. The work was competent and necessary, but it required none of the skills that had made Elena exceptional as a pilot. Her new supervisor, Lieutenant Commander Robert Chen, was a supply officer who had never flown military aircraft. He was competent and professional, but he had no understanding of Elena's background or the significance of her transition from flying to logistics. To Chen, Elena was simply another experienced officer who had been assigned to help manage his department's operations. "Elena, I've reviewed your personnel file, and your organizational skills are exactly what we need here," Chen said during their initial meeting. "Your experience with operational planning should translate well to supply chain management." Elena nodded and accepted the assignment without comment. She understood that Chen was trying to be encouraging, but his words only emphasized how far she had fallen from her former role. The operational planning she had once done involved coordinating airstrikes and managing tactical formations. Now she would be planning the delivery of paper clips and printer toner. The work itself was mind-numbing in its routine predictability. Elena processed purchase orders, tracked delivery schedules, and resolved supply discrepancies with the same methodical precision she had once brought to flying. Her performance was excellent. She identified inefficiencies, streamlined procedures, and improved the reliability of supply deliveries. But the work felt like an elaborate form of professional suicide, a systematic destruction of everything that had once made her life meaningful. Elena's living situation in Norfolk reflected her emotional state. She rented a small apartment near the base that was even more Spartan than her previous residence in Arlington. The walls remained bare, the furniture was minimal, and the only personal item was the same photograph of herself standing next to the F/A-18 Hornet. The image now seemed to mock her, a reminder of a person she had once been but could never be. Again, her social isolation deepened during her time at Norfolk. Unlike the Pentagon, where her colleagues had at least shared her professional background in aviation, the supply department was staffed entirely by logistics specialists who had no connection to flying. Elena's attempts at casual conversation invariably led to questions about her previous assignments, which she deflected with vague references to operational work that discouraged further inquiry. The loneliness was compounded by Elena's growing awareness that she had voluntarily exiled herself from the only community where she had ever truly belonged. Fighter pilots were a small, close-knit group who shared experiences that civilians could never understand. By removing herself from aviation entirely, Elena had cut herself off from the only people who could relate to her background and understand her sense of loss. Elena's days blended into an unchanging routine of administrative tasks and paperwork. She arrived at work early, completed her assignments efficiently, and left promptly at the end of her shift. Her evenings were spent alone in her apartment, reading technical manuals that no longer had any relevance to her career, or watching television programs that failed to hold her interest. The passion and purpose that had once driven her to extraordinary achievements had been replaced by a mechanical existence that felt more like marking time than living. The final degradation came when Elena was assigned to oversee the janitorial services contract for several base facilities. The work involved coordinating cleaning schedules, managing supply inventories for maintenance equipment, and ensuring that contractors met their service obligations. It was necessary work that required attention to detail, but it was also as far removed from her former identity as a fighter pilot as any assignment could possibly be. Elena found herself spending hours each day walking through buildings that she was responsible for maintaining, checking on the work of cleaning crews and maintenance personnel. The irony wasn't lost on her, the woman who had once been entrusted with multi-million-dollar fighter aircraft was now ensuring that office buildings were properly mopped and vacuumed. But it was during these building inspections that Elena began to notice something that would eventually change everything. Norfolk Naval Station was home to multiple commands and activities, including classified facilities that supported carrier operations worldwide. Elena's janitorial oversight responsibilities gave her access to areas of the base that most personnel never saw, including facilities where sensitive operational planning took place. Elena's security clearance remained at the highest levels despite her change in assignment, allowing her to enter secure areas without restriction. As she moved through these facilities during her inspections, she couldn't help but overhear conversations and observe activities that reminded her of her former life. Pilots discussing mission planning, intelligence officers analyzing threat assessments, operations specialists coordinating fleet movements. All of it was familiar territory that Elena understood better than anyone else in the building. The knowledge that she possessed expertise that was desperately needed but completely ignored was devastating. Elena would listen to junior officers struggling with problems that she could solve in minutes, watch planning sessions where her experience could have prevented critical errors, and observe training exercises that were flawed in ways that only someone with her background could identify. But her current role gave her no authority to offer assistance, and her voluntary exile from aviation had stripped away any credibility she might have once possessed. Elena's emotional state continued to deteriorate as she watched the Navy continue its operations without her. The aircraft she had once flown still launched from carrier decks. The missions she had once led were still being conducted by other pilots, and the tactical problems she had once solved were still being addressed by people with far less experience and ability. The world of naval aviation had moved on without Elena Rodriguez, and her absence had been filled so seamlessly that it was as if she had never existed. The final blow came during Elena's third year at Norfolk, when she learned that her former squadron had been deployed to conduct operations in a crisis situation that required exactly the kind of expertise she had once provided. The mission briefings that she read through her continued security access showed planning deficiencies and tactical approaches that could have been improved with her input. But Elena was overseeing janitorial contracts while other pilots flew the missions that she should have been leading. That night, Alina sat in her empty apartment and finally acknowledged the full scope of what she had lost. Her pursuit of perfection had led to burnout, her burnout had led to exile, and her exile had led to a form of professional death that was more complete than she had ever imagined possible. The woman who had once been the most skilled carrier, pilot in naval history was now a forgotten administrator, whose greatest responsibility was ensuring that buildings were properly cleaned. Alina had achieved exactly what she had requested, complete separation from the flying career that had once defined her. But the cost of that separation was turning out to be higher than she had anticipated. She had thought that removing herself from aviation would provide relief from the pressure and expectations that had nearly destroyed her. Instead, she had discovered that life without flying wasn't really life at all, but merely an extended form of professional suicide that left her alive but spiritually dead. The woman who had once landed fighter jets on aircraft carriers during storms was now emptying trash cans and checking bathroom supplies. The transformation was complete, and it was devastating. The emergency klaxon that pierced the pre-dawn darkness at Norfolk Naval Station on October 15th wasn't part of any scheduled drill. Alina Rodriguez was conducting her routine inspection of Building 47, a secure communications facility that housed the Atlantic Fleet's Crisis Coordination Center, when the alarm began its urgent wailing. Through the reinforced windows she could see personnel running across the base as emergency lighting illuminated the normally quiet pathways between buildings. Alina's security badge allowed her access to areas where most base personnel couldn't venture, and her current assignment required her to ensure that critical facilities remained operational regardless of external circumstances. As the alarm continued, she moved through the building's corridors checking that emergency protocols were being followed and that essential systems remained functional. Her clipboard held routine maintenance checklists, but her trained ear was picking up fragments of radio communications that indicated something far more serious than a standard emergency exercise. The communications center's main floor buzzed with activity as watch officers coordinated responses to what was clearly a developing crisis. Alina positioned herself near a supply closet where she could observe the operations center without interfering, her years of experience allowing her to understand the tactical situation from overhead displays and radio chatter that would have been meaningless to most observers. Vice Admiral Patricia Morrison, commander of the Atlantic Fleet's carrier operations, stood at the center of the activity, directing responses to what Alina could now understand was a genuine emergency at sea. The USS Constellation, a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier with over 5,000 crew members aboard, was operating in the North Atlantic when Hurricane Isabel had unexpectedly intensified and changed course. The storm system, originally predicted to remain safely offshore, was now generating waves exceeding 50 feet and winds approaching 200 miles per hour. Alina listened as communication specialists struggled to maintain contact with the Constellation through atmospheric interference created by the hurricane. The ship's position placed it directly in the storm's path with insufficient time to maneuver clear before the worst conditions arrived. Emergency protocols had been activated and all available rescue assets were being mobilized, but the extreme weather was limiting response options. "Admiral, we're losing communication with Constellation," reported Captain James Sullivan, the Operations Center's senior watch officer. Last transmission indicated they're experiencing severe structural stress from the wave action. Flight operations have been suspended, and they're reporting casualties from personnel being thrown around by the ship's motion. Admiral Morrison studied the meteorological displays showing Hurricane Isabel's projected path. The storm was behaving unpredictably, intensifying far more rapidly than forecast models had predicted. Weather specialists were updating their projections hourly, but the fundamental problem remained unchanged: a massive aircraft Carrier was trapped in conditions that exceeded its design specifications. "What's the status of our rescue capabilities?" Morrison asked. "Sir, Coast Guard assets are standing by, but helicopter operations are impossible in these wind conditions. Surface vessels can't operate safely in seas this rough. Our nearest submarines are 12 hours away, but they'd have limited rescue capacity even if they could reach the area." Elena moved closer to the operations display, her trained eye analyzing the tactical situation with the same systematic approach she had once applied to combat missions. The problem was clear. Thousands of sailors were trapped aboard a ship that was being battered by forces beyond human control, and conventional rescue methods were inadequate for the conditions involved. But Elena could see something that the crisis managers were missing. The Constellation's flight deck, despite being damaged by the storm, remained partially operational. The ship's angled landing area was still structurally intact, and the arresting gear system was functional, according to the engineering reports, being transmitted intermittently through the communication blackouts. Under normal circumstances, landing aircraft on a carrier deck during a hurricane would be considered impossible, but Elena understood that normal circumstances no longer applied. "Admiral, recommend we consider emergency helicopter evacuation from the flight deck," suggested Commander Lisa Park, the Operations Center's air operations specialist. "Negative," Admiral Morrison replied immediately. "Helicopter operations are impossible in winds exceeding 100 miles per hour. We'd lose aircraft and crew without helping anyone aboard Constellation." Elena knew that Admiral Morrison was correct about helicopter limitations, but she also knew that there were other aircraft capable of operating in extreme weather conditions that no one in the operations center was considering. Fighter aircraft, specifically the F-A-18 Super Hornet, possessed the structural strength and aerodynamic capabilities necessary to penetrate hurricane-force winds. More importantly, they could land on aircraft carriers using arresting gear systems that were designed to stop aircraft traveling at high speeds. The tactical solution was complex but theoretically possible. A Super Hornet, configured for maximum range and equipped with specialized rescue equipment, could potentially reach the Constellation, land on its storm-battered deck, and evacuate critical personnel. The risks would be enormous. No pilot had ever attempted a carrier landing in hurricane conditions, and the probability of success using conventional approaches was essentially zero. But Elena understood carrier operations better than anyone alive, and she knew that the Constellation's deck motion, while severe, followed predictable patterns based on wave action and ship design. A pilot with sufficient skill and experience could potentially time an approach to coincide with the deck's most stable moments, using the ship's motion to assist rather than hinder the landing process. Elena's analysis was interrupted by a new development in the crisis. The Constellation's captain, through a brief communication window, reported that the ship's nuclear reactor was experiencing cooling system irregularities due to the extreme motion. While not immediately dangerous, the situation required constant monitoring and could potentially lead to emergency shutdown procedures that would leave the ship powerless in hurricane force. Seas, Admiral Constellation reports reactor concerns. Captain Sullivan announced. Engineering assessment indicates they may need to implement emergency cooling procedures within the next 6 hours. The implications were catastrophic. A powerless aircraft carrier in hurricane conditions would be completely at the mercy of wind and waves. Without propulsion and maneuvering capability, the ship would likely break apart or capsize before rescue assets could reach it. The crisis had evolved from a difficult rescue operation to a potential naval disaster that could result in thousands of casualties. Admiral Morrison's expression reflected the weight of responsibility she carried. Every option under consideration involved unacceptable risks, but the alternative was abandoning 5,000 sailors to almost certain death. The conventional wisdom that governed naval operations provided no solutions for a situation this extreme. "Sir, recommend we contact Air Force Hurricane Hunters," suggested Commander Park. "Their aircraft are designed for extreme weather penetration. Hurricane Hunter aircraft aren't equipped for carrier operations," Admiral Morrison replied. "They can reach the area, but they can't land on Constellation's deck or evacuate personnel." Elena stepped forward from her position near the supply closet, her movement catching the attention of several watch officers. Her blue maintenance uniform and identification badge clearly marked her as support personnel, but her presence in the Secure Operations Center indicated high-level security clearance. Admiral Morrison looked at her with curiosity rather than irritation. "Ma'am, do you have information relevant to the situation?" Morrison asked. Elena's response was measured and professional, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had faced similar challenges before. "Admiral, I believe there's a tactical option that hasn't been considered. A Super Hornet configured for extended range could potentially reach Constellation and conduct emergency personnel evacuation using the ship's arresting gear system." The operations center fell silent as every officer present turned to stare at the maintenance worker who had just proposed the most audacious rescue operation in naval history. Admiral Morrison's initial reaction was skeptical. Carrier operations during hurricanes violated every safety protocol and operational procedure in existence. "Miss." Morrison paused, reading Elena's name tag. "Rodriguez, carrier operations in hurricane conditions are impossible. No pilot could survive an approach in those wind conditions." "Respectfully, Admiral, the approach would be extremely dangerous but not impossible for a pilot with sufficient experience in extreme weather carrier operations. The key would be timing the approach to coincide with the deck's most stable period and using modified approach parameters to compensate for wind effects." Captain Sullivan stepped forward, his expression reflecting professional skepticism mixed with desperate hope. "Ma'am, with all due respect, do you have any background in naval aviation that would support this assessment?" Elena hesitated for a moment, understanding that her response would either establish her credibility or end the conversation immediately. The truth about her background would shock everyone in the room, but withholding it would render her tactical analysis meaningless. "Sir, I have approximately 3,000 hours of carrier-based flight time, including extensive experience with extreme weather operations. I've conducted successful carrier landings in conditions approaching those currently affecting Constellation." The silence that followed Elena's statement was profound. Admiral Morrison studied Elena's face carefully, looking for signs of delusion or fabrication. The claim seemed impossible. A maintenance worker with extensive carrier aviation experience was beyond unlikely. "Ms. Rodriguez, what aircraft did you fly, and when did you serve as a naval aviator?" "FA-18 Hornet and Super Hornet variants, Admiral. I completed 4 operational deployments between 1995 and 2010, including combat operations in multiple theaters." Admiral Morrison's expression changed as the implications of Elena's statement became clear. A pilot with that level of experience would be known throughout the naval aviation community, particularly someone who had conducted extreme weather carrier operations. Morrison activated a secure terminal and began accessing personnel databases, her fingers moving quickly across the keyboard. The search results that appeared on her screen caused Morrison to freeze momentarily. Elena Rodriguez's service record was extensive and impressive, documenting achievements that bordered on legendary. Top Gun graduate, multiple commendations for exceptional airmanship, mission commander for classified operations. The record painted a picture of a pilot whose capabilities exceeded normal human limitations. "Captain Rodriguez," Admiral Morrison said, her tone now reflecting recognition of Elena's true rank and status. "Your service record indicates that you were removed from flight status in 2010. What's your current qualification level?" Elena understood the subtext of the question. Military flight status required regular proficiency training and medical certification. Her years away from aviation meant that she was no longer legally qualified to pilot military aircraft, regardless of her past experience and continuing abilities. "Admiral, I haven't flown military aircraft since 2010. My flight qualifications have expired, and I haven't maintained currency in any aircraft systems." The admission should have ended the conversation, but Admiral Morrison found herself facing an impossible decision. Conventional rescue operations were inadequate for the current crisis, and Elena's proposed solution, while incredibly dangerous, represented the only viable option for saving thousands of lives. The question wasn't whether Elena was qualified to attempt the mission. No pilot was qualified for something that had never been attempted before. The question was whether Elena possessed the skills and experience necessary to survive an impossible situation. "Captain Rodriguez, if we could restore your flight status and provide you with a current aircraft, would you be willing to attempt this rescue operation?" Elena's response came without hesitation. "Yes, Admiral." Admiral Morrison looked around the operations center, studying the faces of her staff officers. The proposal violated every regulation and safety protocol in existence, but regulations and protocols had never anticipated a situation this extreme. The decision she was considering would either save thousands of lives or result in the loss of both Elena and whatever aircraft she flew. "Captain Sullivan, contact the nearest air station with Super Hornet capability. I want an aircraft prepared for immediate departure with maximum fuel load and emergency rescue equipment. Also contact medical and legal departments. We need to expedite flight qualification restoration for Captain Rodriguez." The activity that followed Morrison's decision was unprecedented in its urgency and complexity. Flight surgeons were summoned to conduct emergency medical examinations. Legal officers were consulted about liability and authority issues, and maintenance crews began preparing a Super Hornet for a mission that existed outside all established procedures. Elena was escorted to a medical examination room where she underwent the most compressed flight physical in Navy history. Blood pressure, heart rate, vision tests, reflexes all conducted at emergency pace while Hurricane Isabel continued its destructive path toward the constellation. The examining physician, Commander Sarah Chen, had never seen anything like Elena's medical profile. "Captain, your physical condition is exceptional for someone who hasn't maintained flight status," Kim observed. "Your cardiovascular fitness and reflexes are consistent with active aircrew." Elena had maintained her physical conditioning throughout her years in administrative assignments, partly from habit and partly from an unconscious hope that she might someday return to flying. The discipline that had made her an exceptional pilot had never left her, even when she had abandoned the cockpit for office work. While Elena underwent medical evaluation, technical specialists were modifying a Super Hornet for the rescue mission. Additional fuel tanks were installed to extend the aircraft's range. Rescue equipment was loaded into every available space, and communication systems were upgraded to penetrate the electromagnetic interference generated by the hurricane. The most challenging aspect of the preparation was developing flight parameters for carrier operations in hurricane conditions. Elena worked with meteorologists and flight test engineers to calculate approach speeds, landing angles, and timing sequences that might allow a successful carrier landing on a storm-battered deck. The mathematics involved were complex, but Elena's experience provided intuitive insights that no amount of theoretical knowledge could replace. "Captain, our calculations suggest that you'll have approximately a 15-second window during each wave cycle when the deck angle will be within acceptable parameters for landing," explained Lieutenant Commander Mark Thompson, the Navy's senior test pilot. "Missing that window will likely result in either overshooting the deck or striking the ship's superstructure." Elena studied the timing charts and deck motion projections with the same analytical intensity she had once brought to combat mission planning. The margin for error was essentially zero, and success would require split-second timing combined with perfect aircraft control in conditions that no pilot had ever faced before. Understood. What's the latest weather update on Hurricane Isabel? Still intensifying, ma'am. Peak winds are now estimated at 195 miles per hour, with gusts potentially exceeding 220. Wave heights in the constellation's area are reaching 65 feet. The numbers were sobering even for someone with Elena's experience. She had landed on carrier decks during severe weather before, but nothing approaching the conditions currently affecting the North Atlantic. The mission she was preparing to attempt existed beyond the boundaries of what had ever been considered possible in naval aviation. Elena's final preparation was a brief simulator session designed to familiarize her with the latest Super Hornet systems. While the basic aircraft hadn't changed dramatically since her active flying days, avionics and flight control systems had been upgraded in ways that required adaptation. The simulator couldn't replicate hurricane conditions, but it allowed Elena to regain familiarity with aircraft handling characteristics. "Captain, you're cleared for flight operations," announced the flight surgeon after reviewing Elena's medical examination results. "All parameters are within acceptable limits for carrier operations." Elena walked across the flight line toward the waiting Super Hornet as maintenance crews completed their final preparations. The aircraft was fully fueled and equipped with every piece of rescue equipment that could be fitted into its limited space. Weather conditions at Norfolk were already deteriorating as Hurricane Isabel's outer bands reached the coastline, but they were mild compared to what Elena would face over the open ocean. Admiral Morrison approached Elena as she completed her pre-flight inspection, her expression reflecting the weight of the decision she had made. Authorizing this mission violated her better judgment and every principle of aviation safety. But the alternative was accepting the loss of thousands of sailors without attempting any rescue. "Captain Rodriguez, I want you to understand that this mission is entirely voluntary. No one would question your decision if you chose not to attempt it." Elena looked up from her inspection checklist, her eyes reflecting the same calm confidence that had characterized her flying throughout her career. "Admiral, those sailors didn't volunteer to be in a hurricane. Someone needs to try to help them." The conversation was interrupted by an urgent communication from the Constellation. The ship's condition was deteriorating more rapidly than expected, and the reactor cooling system was approaching critical parameters. Elena's mission timeline had just been compressed from hours to minutes. Elena strapped herself into the Super Hornet's cockpit as Hurricane Isabel's winds howled across Norfolk Naval Station with increasing fury. The aircraft trembled against the wheel chocks despite being one of the most robust fighter jets ever built. Through the canopy, she could see ground crews struggling against the wind to complete final preparations, their safety lines stretched taut as they fought to remain upright. The engine startup sequence proceeded flawlessly despite the external chaos. Elena's hands moved across the controls with muscle memory that 15 years of administrative work hadn't diminished. The twin F414 engines spooled up to their characteristic whine, and system displays illuminated with the familiar green glow that indicated all aircraft systems were operational. "Norfolk Tower, Ghost Rider ready for departure," Elena transmitted, using the call sign that had been hastily assigned for the mission. "Ghost Rider, you're cleared for immediate takeoff. Wind is 090 at 85 knots, gusting to 110. Be advised, these are the last favorable conditions you'll see until you reach Constellation." Elena released the wheel brakes and applied full military power. The Super Hornet accelerated down the runway like a rocket, reaching rotation speed in less than 1,000 feet despite the brutal headwind. As the aircraft lifted off, Elena felt the familiar sensation of flight returning to her soul, the perfect harmony between pilot and machine that had defined her existence before exile claimed her. The climb to cruising altitude took Elena through multiple layers of turbulence as Hurricane Isabel's outer bands battered the aircraft with winds that would have grounded any civilian aviation. The Super Hornet's flight control systems worked constantly to maintain stable flight, but Elena's inputs were so precise that the aircraft responded as if the storm didn't exist. Navigation to the constellation's last known position required Elena to fly directly through Isabel's western eye wall, where wind speeds exceeded 180 miles per hour and atmospheric pressure dropped to levels that challenged even military aircraft systems. Elena's route planning had identified a narrow corridor where the Hurricane's structure might allow penetration, but success depended on timing that left no margin for error. Constellation, this is Ghost Rider approaching your position from the southwest. Request immediate weather and deck status, Elena transmitted as she began her descent through the storm's middle layers. The response came through static so heavy that individual words were barely distinguishable. Ghost Rider. Constellation. Conditions deteriorating. Reactor approaching emergency shutdown. Casualties mounting. Elena could see the massive aircraft carrier through brief breaks in the storm clouds, and the sight was both magnificent and terrifying. The 100,000-ton ship was being tossed by waves that dwarfed its imposing bulk, rising and falling through vertical distances that seemed impossible for any man-made structure to survive. The flight deck, normally a stable platform for aircraft operations, was pitching and rolling through angles that would challenge a small boat. But Elena's trained eye could see patterns in the ship's motion that others would miss. The constellations' movements, while violent, followed predictable cycles based on wave intervals and ship design. Between the massive swells, there were brief moments when the deck's motion stabilized relative to the surrounding chaos. Those moments would last only seconds, but seconds were enough for a pilot with Elena's experience. Elena established a holding pattern at 5,000 feet while studying the ship's motion and calculating approach parameters. The standard carrier landing pattern required precise timing under normal conditions, but this situation demanded mathematical precision that pushed human capabilities to their absolute limits. Elena would have exactly one opportunity missing. The approach would likely result in her aircraft being destroyed and any chance of rescue dying with her. Constellation, Ghost Rider requests permission for emergency landing approach. Ghost Rider, negative. Conditions beyond all operational limits. Approach not recommended. Elena understood the ship's reluctance to authorize her landing attempt. No sane person would consider carrier operations in hurricane conditions, and the ship's captain was responsible for the safety of his crew as well as any rescue aircraft. But Elena also understood that conventional safety calculations no longer applied when thousands of lives hung in the balance. Constellation, Ghost Rider declaring emergency approach. I'm coming aboard. Elena rolled her Super Hornet into a steep descent toward the carrier's stern, beginning an approach that existed outside every manual and procedure in naval aviation. Her airspeed was 200 knots higher than normal to maintain control in the hurricane force winds, but she would need to reduce that speed to exactly 150 knots at the moment of touchdown to avoid overshooting the deck. The approach required Elena to fly through wind shears that threw her aircraft around like debris in a tornado. Downdrafts exceeding 5,000 feet per minute tried to drive her into the ocean, while updrafts threatened to carry her over the ship entirely. Elena's control inputs were constant and precise, fighting the hurricane's fury with a combination of skill and determination that bordered on supernatural. Ghost Rider, call the ball, came the transmission from Constellation's landing signal officer, his voice tight with disbelief at what he was witnessing. Ghost Rider, Super Hornet ball, 3-2 manual, Elena responded, indicating her aircraft type, fuel state, and that she was flying manually without automated landing assistance. The optical landing system was barely visible through the rain and spray, but Elena could see the amber meatball that indicated proper glide path. Keeping that light centered between the green datum lights while flying through hurricane conditions required every ounce of skill she possessed. The deck was rising and falling through 40-foot cycles, and Elena would need to time her touchdown for the precise moment when the angle was correct. Elena's Super Hornet descended through the final 1,000 feet in conditions that would have destroyed lesser aircraft. Rain hammered the canopy like machine gun fire, and lightning illuminated the storm-darkened sky with electrical displays that interfered with her instruments. But Elena's focus remained absolute, her attention locked on the ship's deck and the split-second timing that would determine success or catastrophe. At 200 feet above the deck, Elena could see individual crew members securing equipment and preparing for her arrival. The ship's medical teams were standing by with rescue equipment, ready to evacuate wounded personnel if Elena's landing succeeded. The weight of their hopes and the lives that depended on her performance was overwhelming, but Elena had carried similar burdens before. Elena's touchdown came at the exact moment when the deck reached its most stable position in the wave cycle. Her Super Hornet's tailhook caught the number 2 arresting wire with a precision that seemed impossible given the conditions. The aircraft decelerated from 150 knots to 0 in less than 300 feet, and Elena felt the familiar slam of successful carrier landing that she had experienced thousands of times before. But this landing was different from any other in aviation. History. Elena had just accomplished something that every expert had declared impossible: a successful carrier, landing in hurricane conditions that exceeded the design limits of both aircraft and ship. The feat would be studied and analyzed for decades, but in the moment, it was simply another milestone in a career built on pushing beyond accepted limitations. Elena shut down her engines and opened the canopy as deck crews fought hurricane winds to secure her aircraft. The noise was deafening wind rain, and the sound of massive waves crashing against the ship's hull combined into a symphony of natural fury that dwarfed human engineering. But Elena had arrived, and the rescue operation could begin. Captain Mitchell Harrison, Constellation's commanding officer, met Elena at the base of her aircraft's ladder. His face reflected amazement at what he had just witnessed, but also desperate hope that Elena's arrival might provide solutions to the crisis that threatened his ship and crew. "Captain Rodriguez, welcome aboard. I've never seen flying like that in 30 years of naval service." Elena removed her helmet and surveyed the storm-battered flight deck, her mind already calculating logistics for the evacuation operation. "Captain, what's your most critical personnel situation?" "Reactor cooling team in engineering and wounded personnel in medical. If we lose the reactor, we lose power and maneuvering capability. In these seas, that's a death sentence for everyone aboard." Elena understood the priorities immediately. Her Super Hornet could carry additional personnel, but space was extremely limited, and the return flight through the hurricane would be even more challenging than her arrival. Every decision about who to evacuate would literally determine who lived or died. The evacuation operation proceeded with military efficiency, despite the chaotic conditions. Elena worked with the ship's medical team to select personnel whose specialized knowledge was essential for the reactor's continued operation, as well as critically wounded crew members who would not survive without immediate medical attention. Each person loaded into her aircraft represented both a life saved and additional weight that would make the return flight more dangerous. Elena's aircraft was loaded beyond normal capacity, with rescue personnel occupying every available space, including areas normally reserved for equipment and fuel. The additional weight would affect the aircraft's performance characteristics, requiring modified flight procedures for the return journey through Hurricane Isabel's continuing fury. "Captain Rodriguez, reactor status is stabilizing with our key personnel remaining aboard," Captain Harrison reported. Your evacuation of the cooling system specialists has allowed us to maintain critical operations. Elena nodded as she completed her pre-flight inspection in conditions that made normal procedures nearly impossible. Wind gusts exceeding 150 miles per hour threatened to knock her off the deck, and the ship's constant motion required her to time every movement carefully to avoid being thrown against the aircraft. The takeoff from Constellation's deck was as challenging as the landing had been. Elena needed sufficient airspeed for flight while ensuring that her heavily loaded aircraft didn't exceed the deck's limited length. The catapult system provided additional acceleration, but Elena's precise timing and control inputs were essential for achieving flight in conditions that pushed both pilot and aircraft beyond their design limits. Elena's Super Hornet climbed away from the Constellation and into Hurricane Isabel's continuing fury, carrying rescued personnel whose lives depended on her ability to navigate back through the storm. The return flight would be longer and more difficult due to the aircraft's increased weight and the hurricane's continued intensification. Navigation through the storm required Elena to find safe corridors between areas of maximum turbulence while maintaining course toward Norfolk Naval Station. Her passengers, secured in makeshift positions throughout the aircraft, experienced forces and motion that would have been terrifying under normal circumstances. But Elena's flying was so smooth and controlled that even the wounded personnel remained stable throughout the flight. The approach to Norfolk took Elena through the hurricane's outer bands, where conditions were severe but manageable compared to what she had experienced over the open ocean. Emergency vehicles and medical teams were standing by as Elena brought her overloaded aircraft in for a landing that completed the most extraordinary rescue operation in naval aviation history. Elena's touchdown at Norfolk was perfect despite the challenging conditions and aircraft loading. Emergency crews immediately began evacuating the rescued personnel, rushing the wounded to medical facilities while debriefing the reactor specialists about Constellation's continuing situation. Elena remained in her cockpit for several minutes. After shutdown, processing the magnitude of what she had just accomplished, Admiral Morrison approached Elena's aircraft as she climbed down from the cockpit, her expression reflecting profound gratitude mixed with professional amazement. The rescue operation had succeeded beyond all expectations, saving critical personnel while demonstrating capabilities that redefined what was possible in naval aviation. Captain Rodriguez, Constellation reports that reactor operations have stabilized and they expect to ride out the hurricane successfully. Your evacuation of key personnel made the difference between survival and disaster. Elena removed her flight gear and looked back toward the storm-darkened horizon where Hurricane Isabel continued its destructive path. The Constellation was still out there fighting for survival, but Elena's mission had provided the ship with the expertise and resources necessary to endure the crisis. The debriefing that followed Elena's mission was unprecedented in its scope and implications. Flight test engineers analyzed every aspect of her approach and landing procedures, seeking to understand how carrier operations in hurricane conditions had been possible. Medical teams evaluated the rescued personnel and confirmed that Elena's mission had saved lives that would have been lost without immediate evacuation. But perhaps most significantly, Elena's performance had demonstrated that her legendary skills remained intact despite 15 years away from active flying. The woman who had once been the Navy's most capable pilot had proven that excellence, once achieved, could survive even extended periods of exile and administrative work. Admiral Morrison offered Elena immediate reinstatement to active flight status with assignment to any command she desired. The Navy recognized that Elena's capabilities were too valuable to waste on administrative duties, and her performance during the hurricane rescue had eliminated any questions about her continued abilities. Elena's response surprised everyone involved in the debriefing. Rather than requesting assignment to a high-profile command or prestigious position, She asked to return to her previous role with expanded responsibilities for training and emergency response. She had discovered that her true purpose wasn't personal glory or career advancement, but using her abilities to serve others when conventional solutions proved inadequate. Admiral, I'd like to continue my current assignment with additional duties as an emergency response pilot. There are situations where experience matters more than regulations, and someone needs to be available when normal procedures aren't sufficient. Elena's request was approved immediately, creating a new position that recognized her unique capabilities while allowing her to remain connected to the operational Navy. She would continue her administrative responsibilities while maintaining flight status for situations that required extraordinary skills and experience. Elena's story spread quietly through the naval aviation community, not through official channels or press releases, but through the informal networks that connected pilots across all commands. Young aviators learned about the maintenance worker, who had once been a legend, while experienced pilots gained renewed appreciation for the importance of preserving institutional knowledge and respecting excellence regardless of current position. Elena never returned to high-profile assignments or sought recognition for her hurricane rescue mission. She found satisfaction in teaching young pilots about the subtleties of carrier operations, sharing knowledge that couldn't be learned from textbooks or simulators. Her office at Norfolk became an unofficial classroom where aviators came to learn from someone who had pushed the boundaries of what was possible in naval aviation. The bronze plaque that appeared outside Elena's office several months later bore a simple inscription: "Excellence is not a destination but a way of traveling." Nobody knew who had commissioned it, and Elena never asked. She understood that true recognition came not from formal acknowledgments, but from the knowledge that her skills had made a difference when it mattered most. Elena Rodriguez had learned that redemption didn't require returning to previous positions or reclaiming former glory. Sometimes redemption meant discovering new ways to serve, finding purpose in unexpected places, and understanding that the person everyone had stopped seeing might be exactly the person everyone needed to remember. The hurricane had passed, but the lessons remained. In a world where expertise was often overlooked and experience undervalued, Elena's story served as a reminder that wisdom could be found in the most unlikely places, and that sometimes the person pushing a mop cart might be the one who could save everyone. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.